Now, some of the information that you're going to hear this evening or afternoon may be new for some of you, but for others, it may be very familiar. So before we enter this space, it's important to recognize that discussing race can be uncomfortable. So it's important that we are speaking from our hearts and that we are respecting each other and sharing our own ideas and experiences, which may at times be different from our own. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a little information about my professional experience and what brought me into the field of social justice research. I am currently a school counselor working for Pittsburgh Public Schools. I've been in that role for the past 19 years. Also, I've taught as a middle school world cultures teacher. I did that for about 5 years. And then I started to consider doing something a little bit different in my career and applied to Robert Morris University, where I was accepted into their PhD program in Instructional Management and Leadership. In addition, I have a secondary school counselor certification and a principal certification, and I'm an alumni of Point Park University. And finally, I've done a little bit of research on racial trauma-informed pedagogy and submitted 2 chapters for a book on trauma-informed pedagogy. So let's review our agenda so you can have an idea of what we're going to be discussing today. First, we'll go over the presentation norms, and I know that many of you are accustomed to this new virtual arena that we've been thrown into due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So of course, we will have some presentation norms. We'll first start talking about unconscious bias, talk about some unconscious bias prevention tips. There's several interactive activities. So if you are using a laptop or a desktop, if you want to watch the presentation on that device, and once it's time to participate in a few of the polls and surveys, then you can use your cell phone if you have that handy. I'm going to give you some unconscious bias prevention tips. We'll move into racial microaggressions. Then we'll talk about victim, bystander, perpetrator tips. I'll give you some suggested readings. And at the end, we will have time to pose some questions, have a little discussion, and maybe review some wonderings you had during the presentation. If you have questions, please feel free to jot them down. At the end of the session, we will have a chance to go over those questions. And when I'm asking for you to come off mic, feel free to do so, because there will be opportunities for volunteers to perhaps share their experiences. So as far as our norms, the most obvious one that you're probably familiar with is, of course, keeping confidentiality. There will be opportunities for people to share their personal experiences. I've already seen a few familiar names in the audience. Thank you for coming. And you may have people that you either work with or know personally. So of course, whatever we discuss in this forum is to be kept within this forum. When you're speaking, I want you to focus on the impact of your words versus the intent. And what that simply means is your intention may not have been to be offensive, but you have to think about how your words and even your actions may impact someone who's in this session. So let's focus on what your impact is versus what your actual intention was when you began to speak. Of course, when discussing race, you can expect to experience some discomfort, and that discomfort comes for white participants and also for participants who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. Everyone can feel some discomfort. That's normal. What we do want, and what I will be doing, is speaking your truth. And finally, if you're familiar with the Courageous Conversations research, you will know that you can expect and accept non-closure. And that simply means that within this hour-and-a-half session, you're not going to have all of your questions, concerns, or thoughts answered. So expect that you may have some non-closure at the end of this session. And at the end, I will give you some recommendations for books if you want to continue on your learning journey about racial justice issues. All right, so we're going to just jump right in, and I'd like to start us out by posing a question to you, the audience. So what you're going to do is, if you have a cell phone and you're on your computer, any internet browser, I want you to either click on the link that I believe is in the chat, or you can just type in capital POLL, capital EV.com, and you're going to enter the words Dr. Nena Hisle 124. And I want you to answer the question, what words come to mind when you think of unconscious bias? So I'm going to take us to this poll. Once again, it's capital POLL EV. And I want to know what words come to mind when you think of the words, what word comes to your mind when you hear someone say unconscious bias. So at this time, if you can just type in a word, your words will pop up on the screen. I see harm coming up. That's a word that comes to mind. Prejudice, definitely a word. Hurt is often involved with unconscious bias. Blind, definitely an adjective. Having empathy will definitely help with unconscious biases. A blind spot, there's an excellent book called Blind Spot. Ignorance, not ignorance in a negative way, but lack of knowledge. Denial, ignorant, once again. These are definitely denial, once again. All adjectives that tend to come to mind when you're thinking of unconscious biases. I see microaggressions, prejudice. Yes, they're often unintentional, which is the purpose of these type of trainings, so that you're aware of what your biases are. Yes, they can be below the surface. Yes, they can be due to lack of knowledge, ignorance. All of us have unconscious biases. That's correct. I've seen ignorant and ignorance a lot. Yes, there's victims of unconscious bias, and it can be painful. Systemic racism perpetrates unconscious biases. Sometimes it's reactive. It's your brain trying to make connections. You're right. Some people are conditioned. It can definitely be harmful. It's a sense of normal. It's the way we've always done things. We're stereotyping people when we are committing unconscious biases. It can be implicit. Yes, definitely. What my pappy taught me. We will talk about that later. Yes. Stereotyping. Absolutely. Privilege. We've seen that one a few times. Impactful. It definitely impacts people more than you would think. It can be very frustrating. And there's all kinds of unconscious biases. There's biases towards people about their race, about their gender, their ethnicity, their weight, their religion, fat shaming, just everything. Definitely norms. I've seen privileges a lot. Apology is a good adjective. We have to be willing to accept someone's apology because we all have some sort of unconscious bias. Excellent. Nervous. Those are all excellent adjectives. Defenses. Resentment. Definitely. So what we're going to do, for those of you that were able to participate, thank you. I'm going to take you back to the presentation itself so we can continue. Thank you very much for participating. So the next thing we're going to do is a little quick implicit cognition activity. So obviously seeing the words on the screen, you're going to probably already have some preconceived thoughts in your mind. And I want to bring implicit unconscious bias to life by doing this exercise. It's not whether you can complete them, but I want to show you how your brain works. So we're going to play a simple game of word association. This brings me back to college, and I'm thinking about analogies. So think or say aloud. If you're by yourself, you can say it aloud. If you're amongst others, say it to yourself. The word that should go in the blank. Night and most people would say day. Black and most would say white. Young and most would say old. So there was nothing difficult about that task. It was pretty easy to fill in the blanks. You probably already had the response ready before I even told you what to do. And this is an example of how powerful our implicit cognition is and how fast our brain makes associations. Now, in this next activity, when we are faced with incomplete information, we rely on gaps and we quickly want to fill in those gaps. So with this next paragraph, I want you to read it and see if you can read it. Obviously, when you first look at it, it looks as if it's very misspelled. But most of you can read it, and it says, if you can read this paragraph, it's because our minds are very good at putting together pieces of information in a way that is easy for us to make sense of. And our minds do this automatically without our conscious control. So automatically, you were able to make sense based on your ability to associate the words with what they should say, not what they actually say. And these two exercises demonstrate the automatic and associative nature of our implicit processing. So when you're faced with some sort of content, our brains are trying to quickly make sense of what's going on. They're relying on associations that we've stored in our memory. And it's important to recognize that these stored associations don't have to be based on accurate or logical information. Just by seeing certain concepts or seeing certain people grouped together, we naturally internalize certain associations, which is one of the reasons why unconscious biases can be dangerous. So now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of the presentation. First, we will discuss unconscious or implicit biases. They pretty much have the same meaning. And we're going to learn how that if you're not aware of them, they can negatively or positively impact the decision-making that you make in life. So, unconscious biases, of course, they are thoughts and feelings. And you're typically not aware of how they influence your judgments. You're not even aware that you're having them. They're rooted in your preferences, either for or against something. And they can lead you to having positive or negative biases. So once again, all biases are not negative. Sometimes they're positive things. Remember, we all have unconscious biases, no matter what race, ethnicity, gender, whatever you are, or whatever you identify with or as, we all have unconscious biases in some area. The good news is you can work to lessen these biases. Understand they happen often automatically without forethought. And they typically happen when you're under pressure and you have to make a quick decision. Now, unconscious biases actually develop in childhood, and that's due to repeated reinforcement from social stereotypes that children are exposed to from either their communities, their homes, their families. Social media, of course, is a huge one, and also within schools. Biases like racial microaggressions are often unintentional, and we'll learn more about racial microaggressions as we progress during this session. The main reason we commit these biases and microaggressions are we aren't thinking before we speak. We're using old phrases that have been handed down generation after generation. I remember someone in the first activity wrote something like, "That's what my pappy said," or "That's what my pappy told me." They may be words or phrases or slang terms that you've heard over the years, but you didn't realize that they had some offensive connotation to them. Research also shows that children and adults often have a pro-white bias. And what that simply means is because the majority of our society is white or Caucasian, we tend to have a bias towards that group of people. And these biases can develop in children as early as 3 years of age. Now, biases can be harmful when you start to base them on inaccurate stereotypes or information. So if you're in a stressful situation, you're often using some sort of racial stereotype to make a decision. And these stereotypes are generally based on certain fixed opinions that people have about racial groups. And as we all know, stereotypes can be true at times, but it's important that you recognize that it's a stereotype, because if you don't, then it can lead to unconscious biases. Interestingly enough, I'm not sure if you're familiar with any research on police officers and unconscious biases, but there was a Stanford University study which examined police body camera footage and uncovered that police officers, all police officers, not just white, spoke less respectfully to Black residents compared to white residents. So for examples, these officers would refer to Black residents not using respectful terms such as sir or ma'am. They would be more likely to give sharp commands to this group of people. They would rarely apologize to them or express any expressions of gratitude. And this lack of respect that the study showed that police officers show residents who are Black could be based on negative racial assumptions or unconscious biases that these officers have. So next we're going to look at, I can get to the right, there we go. We're going to look at the good news is that you can reduce unconscious biases. And later we'll learn that you can also reduce microaggressions. So in order to reduce these biases, you have to understand what biases exist and which ones you have. Before doing this research, I wasn't aware that you could even have a bias other than something about race. But there are biases, as we spoke about earlier, for really every pretty much area in life. You can be biased. You have to be accountable for your biases. You have to examine how your personal and professional decisions are being made so that unconscious biases don't come into play. And be consistent with your decision-making process. Make sure that if you're in a leadership position or if you work as an educator, make sure that you are making decisions that are consistent for all groups of people. Seek support from a friend or a colleague that you trust to examine whether or not you're being biased. So once again, I work as a school counselor. I often consult with my principal, or she'll consult with me as to whether or not the decision that she's making is showing bias. And once again, it's not always about race. It could be about the behavior of a child. So she wants to make sure that she's making a decision based on concrete facts, not any biases she may have. So as we mentioned earlier, there's all sorts of biases. The biases you see on the screen would be considered positive biases. So let's think about it. If you're someone who prefers bananas over oranges, that's a positive bias. It's really not going to hurt anyone. Overall, they have different nutritional values, but they're both fruits. They're healthy. You're not going to hurt anyone. If you have a bias over Boston Terrier puppies versus boxer puppies, overall, you're not going to have, it's not going to cause anyone any harm if you choose one breed of a dog over another. And finally, unless you have a seafood allergy, if you have a bias for crab legs versus steak, that's not going to really hurt anyone overall. Your health might not be so great if you choose the steak, but you're not going to hurt anyone. So these biases, not that big of a deal. They're all positive. No one's feelings are hurt. Laws aren't being broken. No one feels discriminated against. However, on the next slide, it may be more difficult for most of you to actually make a choice on what to choose, let alone everyone in this audience. Letting everyone know in this audience also could lead to some people being offended. So on the next slide, you don't have to say what your choice would be. So negative biases start to come into play when you have to make choices, especially choices about people. And it gets challenging if you're choosing between two employees. And if you are, say you're a manager and you're a white female manager and you're looking for a new employee. If you're choosing the woman at the top because she's a white female candidate, you may be more comfortable and familiar with this race of people, and you choose her over the Muslim person based on things other than that one person's more qualified or one person has more experience. That's when you get into negative biases. The second thing is body image. Say you're a clothing designer and you only design clothes for people who are a size 12 or smaller, rather than catering to plus sizes also. That becomes a negative bias. Or perhaps you work for a marketing firm and you're tasked with finding an athlete to represent your company. If you choose the actor who doesn't have the disability because he looks more like the image the company is trying to portray, that's when your biases can become negative, and that's when they can be based on unsubstantiated stereotypes, beliefs, or thoughts. And once again, negative biases tend to be detrimental to the people that they impact. All right, so we're going to move from listening, and we're going to go back to my friend Poll Everywhere. And I want to know, how much do you know about bias? So once again, you're either going to click on the chat link, or you're going to go to capital POLL, capital EV.com, enter in Dr. Nena Hisle. And once again, if you can do this quiz on a different device, so you can actually view the results on one of your devices, that would be great. And the poll should be open now. And then we will be able to see your results shortly. So take about a minute or so to answer the quiz questions. I'll give you about 2 minutes to answer the quiz questions. And then we are going to share these results as a group, so you can have a better idea of how unconscious biases do impact people in different areas of life. So I'm going to give you about a minute or two. If you can respond to these quiz questions. There's about 9 or 10 questions. See where we are as far as responses. I'm just quickly going through people's responses to see where you are, and then we will go through the questions together so we can reveal what the results are. And these are actual facts that have been researched with data to support what the facts are. Let's see, we need just a few more people to do the next question about the consent to search. And then looking at the next question, K through 12 students who are perceived to be transgender, about the discrimination that they experience. Responses there. All right, so I'm going to take you back to the original question so that we can share what most participants said or thought. Looks like most people are complete or almost there. So for question number 1, I've heard about this research a ton of times about how people are discriminated against based on their name. And it's typically if their name has an ethnic sound to it. So some researchers in America sent out 2 fictional job applications to 127 professors. And we would assume, which is a stereotype, that professors, based on their knowledge, based on their years of college, and based on the fact that they work with children, young adults, or adults, that they probably shouldn't be, and I use air quotes, biased. But these professors were given candidates that had the same age, the same grades, the same references. The only difference was their name. And for those of you that chose John, you are correct. John definitely was more likely to be hired. Not only was he more likely to be hired, he would be more likely to get a starting salary of $4,000 more. $4,000 can average out to be quite a bit over the lifetime of a job. So there's definitely some gender discrimination going on here. The next question asked or stated that the best looking people on average make more money during their lifetime compared to people that are thought to be less attractive. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, this is true also. Research does show that people that are considered more attractive are given more favor or are given more money when they're working on their jobs. So that's true. Question number 3. The survey revealed that if you chose, obesity, 75% of these adults with obesity experience weight prejudice from their coworkers. So that is something that I've experienced personally at my job. Many of you may have experienced something similar also. Next, we're going to look at only white people hold biases. I was hoping that everyone would say that that's false, because it's obviously false. And I told you at the beginning of the presentation that everyone holds biases. So that was false. The next question, the maternity leave question. This one could be a little bit tricky, because perhaps the person who was telling the woman who had just returned from maternity leave was thinking that they were trying to be fair, they were trying to be considerate, they were trying to cut her a break because they knew she had just had a baby. But that's a bias. You're making an assumption that just because she just had a child, that she does not have supports in place to be able to do her job to the best of her ability. It would be the same thing as a man. Would you assume after he had a baby that he couldn't go on a business trip or take on extra responsibilities? And that's how you check yourself when it comes to biases. When you're making a decision, you think whether or not you would make this same decision for someone if they shared a different ethnicity or race, a different gender, a different sexual orientation. That's a way that you can correct yourself or check if you're being biased. The next question, we can only hold unconscious biases toward people who are different than us. And that is false. We can hold biases towards people that look like us, same weight, same gender, same ethnicity. You can commit unconscious biases towards anyone. Once again, I mentioned this study was done, it's been done over and over again, but the Toronto study uncovered that people that had Asian sounding last names were 20 to 40% less likely to receive a call back for a job. I can understand personally, what this is like, because as someone who is looking for a job in higher ed, sometimes I'm a little bit nervous about indicating whether or not I'm Black or white when they ask the ethnicity question when you're submitting an application in, because it's always in the back of my mind that perhaps if they find out that I'm a person of color, that I may not be hired. And when we move into racial microaggressions, you'll understand that those are the thoughts that start to come up when you are the victim of either bias, unconscious bias, or some sort of microaggression. You begin to become paranoid as to whether or not there's some factor that will disqualify you, which of course wouldn't be fair. This question about Chicago police officers, the answer to that is that you are 4 times more likely. It was the 4 times, so only 5% of you got that. I threw that one in to be a little bit tricky because I assumed that most of you would think it was 10 times. But even 4 times is too many more. Even 2 times would be too many more to think that one ethnic group or 2 ethnic groups were more likely to be searched during a traffic stop. So that was my little teacher trick question. The next question, the group of minorities that's 2 times more likely. For that answer, let me see, we have 78% of you said Asian and Black, and you are correct. They are the group that tends to be stopped and asked to search more than others. And the final question about K through 12 students, it looks like maybe you weren't able to respond to this one because I don't see any responses. But the answer for that is 54% of K through 12 students who were perceived to be transgender or open about their transgender status reported that they were verbally harassed while in school. 54%. That's way too high. So we're going to take us back to the PowerPoint presentation and get us moving a little further on. So now we're going to move into racial microaggressions. And I don't think I mentioned that the research that I conducted when I finished my PhD was on whether or not Black and white teachers working in a large urban school district experienced racial microaggressions. And there was very little research in that area. And typically when there is research on racial microaggressions, they've examined the experiences of Black people. I wanted to include the white teachers because I felt like they may have some insight into racial microaggressions that are going on that some of their Black colleagues may not be aware of. So that's what led me to doing research on racial microaggressions. So these two gentlemen on the screen are what I probably would call the godfathers of microaggressions and racial microaggressions. Chester Pierce on the left actually coined the original microaggression term back in 1970. And he defined microaggressions as subtle slights or put downs that are directed towards Black people, which cause them to feel degraded and humiliated. And even though Daryl Wing Sue on the right definitely agreed with Dr. Pierce's definition, he expanded it a little more to include race. He called them racial microaggressions that impact all people of color when they are experiencing brief, everyday insults, slights, indignities, denigrating messages that are sent to people of color. And he emphasized that it's typically by well-intentioned white people, and they're most often unaware of the hidden messages being communicated. So earlier when we were talking about what the norms would be for this presentation, I mentioned that it's important to recognize that your intent may not to be offensive, but the impact of your words or actions are what you have to worry about, whether or not they are impactful in a negative way. So that's what microaggressions are. They're unintentional typically, and we'll learn more about them. Sue believed that the perpetrators generally weren't aware of their offensive behavior. And I agree with both of the definitions. And in a few seconds, we're going to learn a bit more about how they impact people of color. So this is the general, pretty much accepted definition of racial microaggressions. They are everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights. They're snubs or insults. Sometimes they're intentional, other times they're unintentional. But they communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to the target person based upon their membership in a marginalized group. And a marginalized group is someone in society, either a person of color, or maybe a poor person, or maybe someone who's, shares, maybe a transgender person, or a person who's a part of the LGBTQIA community. Those will be considered marginalized groups of people. Now, it's important to understand that racial microaggressions are not just a one-time insult. This is the everyday. This is hearing it weekly, hearing it daily. It leads to something called racial battle fatigue, where you're just exhausted when you're dealing with all of the racial strife and stress that can be associated with being a person of color. Now, racial microaggressions occur 3 different ways. They can be verbal, which pretty obviously they're comments or questions that can be hurtful or stigmatizing to certain marginalized groups of people. So an example would be telling a Black person that you personally can't be racist because you have a Black grandson, or saying that you're colorblind. Stating that you're colorblind is making the person of color believe that it would be a bad thing to see their color. So saying I don't see color, I'm colorblind, may seem as if it's a compliment, but it's actually offensive. Another example would be asking an Asian person or someone who looks, and I say that in air quotes, foreign, asking them where they're really from. Say you have a friend, Karen, and you ask Karen where she's from, and she says, I'm from Pittsburgh. Karen is Asian. You look at Karen and you ask her, where are you really from, Karen? Because you don't believe that she could be born and raised here in Pittsburgh. You assume because she looks foreign or perhaps she has an accent that she has to be a foreigner. That's a microaggression. Now, behavioral microaggressions. I've done many of these sessions where I've talked to people where they've experienced the microaggression that you see on the screen. It's when someone is behaving in a way that's either hurtful or discriminatory towards a certain group of people. So perhaps you're someone who works at a grocery store, and you have two customers standing there. One is a Latino customer and the other is a white customer. Instead of asking who's next, you automatically go to service the white customer. That could be considered a behavioral microaggression. Another one, clutching your purse out of fear when you see someone of color walking past. Many Black men especially, and also Black females, experience this microaggression, this fear of them based on their race. An interesting example that I used to give was, as an example of a behavioral microaggression, was if a Black person entered an elevator and white people were on it, and either they got off or they clutched their purses or they looked uneasy. But with COVID and the fact that you could possibly transmit COVID being in a closed-in environment, many people don't want to be on the elevator with groups of people they don't know. So I decided not to use that one as an example of a microaggression. And that's what makes microaggressions so frustrating and detrimental, because even if a microaggression isn't occurring, in the back of your mind, you have to contemplate, you have to think whether or not that's the case. And typically, if you're a white person, you're not thinking that you're being either singled out or being treated a certain way based on your race. Normally you're not, but there are of course situations where you may feel that way. And finally, this is a big one, especially in schools, environmental. These are subtle discriminations that occur within society. So maybe you're on a college campus, that's a picture of an auditorium, and the only people that you see on the wall are white men. That makes a person of color feel as if that they are not welcome in this space and that they may not have the same shared experiences, the same welcomeness, the same respect. Now understand, everyone of color does not feel like they're the victim of racial microaggressions. There are some people that these experiences that they have may not impact them. So it's important that you recognize that every person of color does not feel as if they experience racial microaggressions. So there's 3 different types of microaggressions, and they're basically at 3 levels. The simplest one, that's probably the most benign, but still offensive, would be the micro insult. So this one is considered typically unintentional, it's subtle, it's some sort of rude action or behavior. Typically, the person who commits this microaggression truly is not aware that they've even been offensive. And when you make them aware of it, they tend to be genuinely surprised and embarrassed by their conduct. The next would be a micro invalidation. Now, a micro invalidation undermines someone's racial experiences. It does communications that subtly exclude, negate, or ignore someone's thoughts or feelings. So an example of a microaggression is mistaking people of the same race. I am one of 2 Black females that work at my school. I can proudly say that the other Black female is a lovely woman who looks absolutely nothing like me. Our hairstyles are different, our skin tones are different, our body shape is different. Yet a person who is employed at the school next door, who had never spoken to me before, decided to make a comment to me about my vanity license plate on my vehicle. And I knew that she wasn't talking to me because I don't have a vanity license plate. But it was a microaggression because she assumed that I was the other Black teacher who worked in the school. So it's things like that. I'm sure her intention was not to be offensive, but being as though she didn't think before she spoke, she committed a micro invalidation. And then finally, the micro assault would be the most severe. That, according to Dr. Sue, is the most intentional, it's violent, it's obvious, it's deliberate. You have no doubt that the person is trying to be offensive. So an example of this, of course, would be calling someone a racial slur, or perhaps clutching your purse when you're walking across the street, or having an offensive sign or a poster or some other visual display. That's an all-out assault. The victim has no doubt that you are trying to be offensive. So what we're going to move to next is, I'm going to show you a short YouTube clip that gives you what can be considered humorous examples of microaggressions that people commit, and it's demonstrated in movies. Understand that these are humorous because they're in a movie, but I just want to make sure that I qualify and it's clear that no microaggression or racial microaggression is funny. They can be very painful and impactful mentally and also physically towards someone's health. But I am a person who likes to laugh and have a good time. I don't always take things too serious. So I'd like to share this clip of microaggressions explained with movies.
Ew, get off of me.
Sophie, go to the little girl's room for a minute, okay?
So excited.
There's going to be some things that you're going to be able to get that other people in the office don't get. One of them, gym membership.
Hey, you want me to lose weight?
No, I don't want you to.
Look, you're missing the sight. That's what you're doing. We're missing the action.
Oye, sabrosura. You want to have some ice cream with my friend of me?
Get lost, greaseball.
Microaggressions are along a continuum from being very deliberate and conscious to being outside one's conscious behavior. We identified 3 types of microaggressions. Microassaults, which are very similar to old-fashioned racism.
Your kind don't understand English.
My kind?
The other types of microaggressions are more insidious, hidden, subtle, and the second type is a micro-insult. A couple of color comes into a restaurant to be seated. They're seated in a more undesirable place than a white couple who might be coming in.
Did you see any white people in there waiting an hour and 32 minutes for a plate of spaghetti? Huh? And how many cups of coffee did we get?
You don't drink coffee, and I didn't want any.
Man, that woman in there poured cup after cup to every single white person around us. But did she even ask you if you wanted any?
A micro-invalidation assailed their racial identity and self-esteem. Let's say African Americans, they are dangerous and criminal.
You see that?
What, she's cold.
She got colder as soon as she saw us, though.
Oh, man, come on, don't stop.
Man, look around you, man. You couldn't find a whiter, safer, or better lit part of this city right now.
There can be racial microaggressions, sexual orientation microaggressions, disability microaggressions, and gender microaggressions. Catcalls, staring at a woman's breasts or legs. It's a microaggression because it fulfills the theme of what we call sexual objectification.
I love the fact that you're a grandmother.
Oh, God!
You are! You're a hot grandma!
Oh, my God!
Environmental microaggressions are a hostile and invalidating climate. If you choose to stay, you will be uncomfortable.
Yo, Mook! Mookie!
What?
Come you got no brothers up on the wall?
Man, ask Sal, right?
Hey, Sal, how come you got no brothers up on the wall here?
You want brothers on the wall? Get your own place. You can do what you want to do.
Making trouble? Yeah, I'm a troublemaker. I'm making trouble.
You both make. Just coming in here looking for trouble. Suppose I busted your head.
Microaggressions are cumulative, and any one may represent the feather that breaks a camel's back.
Near the bush, you said you were going to get Jose to do it.
He your garden, and why you don't tell him?
Lucy, you know I don't speak Mexican.
I'm not a Mexican.
How unpopular Vietnam was.
I'm not Vietnamese, I'm American.
What, you think I'm gay? Aren't you? What's the matter with you? Do I look gay to you? Do I look gay to you?
You're a good-looking man.
Thank you.
Very pretty. Real soft, delicate features. They're real feminine, you know, which is good for me because that would be a simple sort of transition.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
So this is just an idea of
Tuck your sack back.
what types of microaggressions that many people are victimized by. Once again, it talked about disability, ability. There was the language. It talked about gender. It talked about ethnicity. So I just want you to sit and think about different types of microaggressions that you may have seen in the movie and whether or not any of them resonated with you. At the end of the session, we are going to have an opportunity for volunteers that would like to come off mic to possibly share some of their experiences with either racial or gender or some other type of microaggression. So now we're going to look at the 8 racial microaggression themes. These themes are not in any particular order. The first one is the denial of individual racism. This is one that I hear a lot. Once again, I work at a school. I've heard a few parents use it, saying that you have Black friends or that you dated a Black person or a person of color does not indicate that you do not have racial microaggression thoughts or that you never victimized someone by a racial microaggression. So the denial of individual racism is basically denying that you could have personal racial biases. So once again, saying that I'm not a racist because my grandchildren are mixed or are biracial. That does not mean that you do not have racist ideas, thoughts, or actions. The message that's being sent is that you're immune to racism because you have someone of color in your life, which invalidates the person of color's experiences with racism. And once again, if you were born and raised here within the United States, based on the culture across this country, it is very difficult to be raised without having some racist views or some sort of biases towards people that may not share the same ethnicity or race that you have. I didn't say impossible, but it would be difficult. The next is the ascription of intelligence. You're assigning intelligence to a person of color based on their race. So the racial microaggression could be that you are a credit to your race. I've heard that a few times, or making the assumption that an Asian American person is bright in math or science and asking them to help you with those problems. And even though that might sound like a positive microaggression, because what group of people would not want to be thought of as intelligent, it also causes a lot of stress and a lot of strain for people of that ethnic group because they often feel that they are forced to live up to this stereotype. I had to personally catch myself committing this microaggression towards a student that I had who had an IEP, which is an individual education learning plan, meaning he had some struggles academically and he was Asian. And I had to check myself because I was surprised he was the first Asian student that I ever had who had learning disabilities. What I was committing was a racial microaggression. I assumed because of his race that he should be intelligent, which of course is not always the case. The next is a big one experienced by people of color. You can see on the screen that we have had over the past few years quite a bit of white individuals calling the police on either unarmed Black people or people that they're accusing of either stealing or committing some sort of crime. And they're making the assumption towards them based on their race. So that is assuming that a person of color is dangerous, criminal, or deviant due to their race. An example would be a store owner following a person of color around the store. This has happened to me a few times, not very often personally, but it does happen to people of color. And it's not just asking them, can I help you find something, or are you finding everything okay? It's surveilling them, watching them because you believe that they're going to take something. And the message that's sent is, you're going to steal, you do not belong in this store, you are a criminal, or that you're dangerous. And it can happen to any person of color, no matter their economic status, no matter their position in life. Anyone can become the victim of that type of racial microaggression. The next is a big one, typically for someone who is Asian or Latino, considering or thinking that they are an alien or foreign in their own land, that they could not have been born here. So as we mentioned earlier, it's asking the question, where are you from? Not believing that they're from somewhere here in the United States. Telling an Asian or a Latino person that they speak good English, or asking an Asian American person to teach them words in their native language. Asking anyone of a different ethnicity. Unless that person volunteers to share that with you, to make the assumption that they either speak, if they're Asian, an Asian language, or if they're Latino, speaking Spanish or Portuguese. Those are all racial assumptions, and they are microaggressions. It's sending the message that you're not from America and that you are foreign, or that you are less than me if I am a non-person of color. Second-class citizen. This happens often. It's when a white person is given preferential treatment as a consumer over a person of color. Some other examples of this type of racial microaggression would be referring to people of color as you people, or a person of color being mistaken for a service worker, being ignored at a store counter as attention is given to the white customer over you. The message that's being sent is you don't belong, you're a lesser being, or that people of color are servants to whites and that they couldn't possibly occupy a high status position. I have a good friend who's very, very well versed in racial microaggressions and social justice issues. However, she had to check herself when she was dining with her family at an Asian restaurant, and there was an Asian person walking past. She assumed that he was the waiter. She kept trying to force the check into his hand, and she had to laugh about it later because she realized how ridiculous it was, as she started to become so angry when he wouldn't take the check. And he had to politely tell her, I don't work here, I'm eating here. And this is someone who I would definitely consider one of the least racist people that I know. But it's these stereotypes, it's these assumptions that people fit into a certain mold or position based on their race or ethnicity. And the message that's being sent is, once again, that people of color are less than people who are white. Now, the next one, the myth of meritocracy. This one was a little bit difficult for me to grasp initially. This is the belief that race does not play a role in life successes. It's the assumption that everyone has the same opportunities, the same chances to get a job, to get a car, to earn credit. It's the assumption that race doesn't play a role in people's life successes. So you'll often hear people say that I believe the most qualified person should get the job. We all agree that that's how it should be. However, in our society, there are people, unfortunately, that put barriers or that put different things in a person of color's path that makes it difficult for them to achieve on the same level as a white person. So you can see the image on the screen. We have a Black woman who has a ladder. It's the same height. She's climbing up the same direction. We have a white male. He has a ladder also. But notice his ladder has all of the rungs, which makes it easier for him to climb. She has half the rungs on the ladder, but she's expected to achieve at the same level. She probably could if she had the same tools that he had to get to where they're both trying to go. And the message is that people of color are given unfair benefits because of their race, or that people of color are lazy or incompetent if they don't make it to the same level as a white person. But that's not always the case. Sometimes there's systemic racism, and there are things in place that make it difficult for people of color to achieve on the same level. The next we're going to look at is pathologizing cultural values and communication styles. This sends the message that the dominant white culture is ideal or normal, that everyone living in the United States should speak English, or saying things to a Black woman or man because they communicate differently. Maybe their voice is a little louder, maybe they're a little more animated. Asking a Black woman why she's always angry, or the angry Black woman, or dismissing when someone mentions race or culture during a discussion, saying things like you're trying to play the race card or pull the race card. And the message that this microaggression sends is that everyone should assimilate to the dominant culture, which within the United States is typically the white culture. And it's telling these people of color that they should just leave their cultural baggage outside, just come in, it's a melting pot, everyone should be the same. And that minimizes their cultural identity, because we are not all the same. We all can work together and, you know, work in unity, but you have to recognize everyone's differences and how that brings something positive to the table. And the final thing, which is a big one, is color blindness. This is a statement that makes it appear as if a white person doesn't want to acknowledge race, as if acknowledging race is a bad thing. I work with middle school students, and I have some of them that are hesitant about describing someone's race when they're talking to me. If they're referring to a Black person, they're nervously saying, well, he or she's Black, or they're African American, and they're stumbling around for the appropriate term to use. So it's important to understand it's okay to talk about race. Saying things like there's only one race, the human race. Once again, that denies a person of color's racial or ethnic experience. And it makes the assumption or the belief that everyone should assimilate to the dominant culture. So as we start to wind down, it's important that you recognize that racial microaggressions do have an impact on people's health. It's not just someone being overly sensitive. It's not just people getting their feelings hurt. Extensive research indicates that racial microaggressions can do more than hurt your feelings. It can lead to high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, drug and alcohol abuse, anxiety, which is a big one that I experience because you're wondering if your race is impacting the experiences that you have out in society. They can also lead to depression, frustration, anger, and even suicide. So when we're talking about anger and you're talking to a person of color and you're wondering why they're so angry at times, sometimes it gets very frustrating as a person of color having to explain things to white people that you believe should be common sense, common knowledge. So that is why it may appear as if someone of color is angry at times, because it becomes draining, racial battle fatigue. It becomes exhausting having to deal with how race impacts a person of color. You're probably wondering, okay, we know what racial microaggressions are. We know what unconscious biases are. What can I do about it? What's the takeaway? What can we do? The most important thing that most people don't do, and I will admit that I'm guilty of this, is to think before you speak. Sometimes if you are around a group of people that you may not be comfortable with or accustomed to being around, you become nervous and you say and act in ways that are based on stereotypes unconsciously. So to avoid committing these racial microaggressions is the first thing you want to do is think before you speak. So you often hear people joke about saying that they have no filter. And anyone in here that knows me knows that I'm very guilty of not having a filter at times. And this may sound funny, and it may not sound funny to some of you, But not having a filter and not thinking before you speak can cause you to commit painful and offensive microaggressions and racial microaggressions. And they can really have a lasting impact on a person's life. So it's essential that you think about what you say before you say it. So let's look at what it means to use judgment before you speak. You want to ask yourself, should I filter my words for the audience that I'm speaking with? When it comes to intention, why am I really saying this to this person? Am I saying it out of genuine curiosity because I want to understand them as a person, or am I saying this to be offensive, or am I trying to be mean? When it comes to choices, we all have a choice to say what we say. So think, are your words really necessary? Do you really need to say what you're about to say? Compassion, that's one thing our society is lacking so much of, is compassion. You want to think, how are your words going to impact the other person? And you have to use empathy, another thing we need more of. And you want to put yourself in that other person's shoes and think about whether or not you would be offended by your words or actions. If someone commits a racial microaggressions and they try to apologize, are you letting them explain and actually listening to what they say and being willing to accept their apology? We need to give people more grace and understand that the majority of people are not intending to be offensive. So it's important that you're willing, if they have the courage to come back and apologize or recognize that their actions or words are offensive, that you have the willingness to be empathetic, compassionate, and be willing to accept their apology or have a discussion. You have to think, is this going to embarrass the person? Think about if it would embarrass you. Think about whether or not your words are respectful. Are your words coming out the wrong way when you say them? Typically, when someone has a word beforehand and says, I'm not trying to be offensive, or I don't want to hurt your feelings, typically they may be about to say something that's offensive. So if you're thinking that before you say something, perhaps you shouldn't say it. As I tell my kids at school, just because you know it doesn't mean you have to say it or share it. So if you're the victim of microaggressions, the hardest part about being a victim is deciding whether or not you should say anything. So you have to decide, is further conversation going to be beneficial, and will it be productive? Typically, as we discussed, racial microaggressions are very subtle. Oftentimes you don't realize you've even been offended until after the incident. So you have to decide, am I just going to ignore the situation? Or will I have a passive aggressive response, such as perhaps a sarcastic comment back? And even though people sometimes look down on passive aggressive behaviors, depending on the power structure or who the racial microaggression has been perpetrated by, you may need to use a passive aggressive approach. If it's your boss who commits a racial microaggression and you two don't have a good working relationship, it may not be safe for you to actually stand up and say something about the microaggression. You have to ask, am I going to address this situation head on and express how the comment made you feel? But you have to also be willing to accept what their response may be back to you, because it may not be a positive exchange. So you want to take a deep breath. You want to think first before you react. You don't always have to address the microaggression when it occurs. You can come back later and tell the person you've had some time to think about the encounter that you had, and you'd like to privately talk to them about it. Before you make the assumption that someone is committing a racial microaggression as a victim, you can ask a follow-up question and say, who were you referring to when you said that? Or what do you mean? That may allow you to avoid an uncomfortable situation, because you may have assumed that they were committing a racial microaggression because you misinterpreted their actions or what they were saying. And by asking a follow-up question, that gives them an opportunity to share what they really meant. The one thing you don't want to do is call the perpetrator a racist. For most white people, that is the worst insult that you can possibly give them, especially if they are not someone who believes they are racist. And if you do that, you're automatically going to shut down the conversation because you can't predict whether or not what a person's intentions were. They most likely are going to deny that they're racist. And once again, you can't prove their intent. What you want to do is tell them how their words or actions made them feel or made you feel. So you definitely don't want to come out on an all-out attack. If you're so angry when it happens, it's best that you revisit it after you've had a chance to consult with maybe a friend, a family worker, a family member, or another coworker to see how you should handle the situation. You don't always have to react. If you're a bystander, being a bystander sounds easy because you're not the victim, but it can also be very, very uncomfortable for you. Because if you're a bystander and your friend has just had a racial microaggression committed against them, you're now put in a position to decide whether or not you should speak up or say anything. So this may sound a little bit silly, rehearsing something, but you want to start thinking about how bystanders and allies can rehearse what they would say or how they would intervene if a racial microaggression occurs. So you want to tailor your approach to the situation. It depends on what type of microaggression is taking place as to whether or not you intervene. It also depends on the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator of the microaggression, and also your relationship with the two people. So you have to determine before you say anything, sometimes in a split minute, as to what approach would be most effective. Another suggestion would be to educate the perpetrator. So if the racial microaggression appears to be unintentional, by educating the perpetrator either when it happens or privately later, which is typically what I recommend if possible, because then the perpetrator is not feeling as if they are being attacked, which could, of course, lead into something totally different. You could say something like, I know you meant well, but that stereotype or comment is hurtful to people. So don't feel forced to intervene, but as a bystander, you are an ally to the victim, and it's important that people start standing up and trying to interrupt these type of situations that are happening. The other thing that becomes draining is, as a person of color, it's not our responsibility to educate white people on how not to commit racial microaggressions, how to be an anti-racist. And later at the end of the presentation, on the next few slides, I will give you some tips on how you can better educate yourself and prepare yourself to be an ally to someone of color. If you commit a racial microaggression, this is when it gets tough. It's hard for the victim to actually say that they've been victimized. And as the perpetrator of the microaggression, it's often hard to hear it. So you want to listen. You have to listen to the victim's feelings. Put yourself in their situation to see how they feel. Don't deny that you've committed the microaggression, because even if you feel as if you didn't, it's important that you don't explain away your behavior. You don't want to flip the guilt on the other person or the victim for confronting you. You often have people that say that they are the victims of reverse racism, which is another talk. Now is not the time for you to share how you've been victimized. You want to listen to the victim. You don't want to deny your actions. You want to address the harmful content that they're talking about. And then most importantly, you want to make a real commitment to doing better. And understand, these interracial conversations are essential for us all to be able to work together successfully. So in closing, I wanted to think of a quote that I thought would be appropriate for a presentation such as this. And I came across Maya Angelou's quote, because I think it's important that people recognize you have to be knowledgeable about your biases. You have to be knowledgeable about your microaggression. the ones that you perpetrate. So now that you know better, the question is, are you going to do better? So Maya Angelou in her quote says, you can do the best that you can until you know better. So now we all know better. And now that you know better, it's essential that we all commit to doing better. Think about this next question. Now that you know better, what will you do with it? Will you do better? Will you continue the journey to find out more about racial microaggressions, more about committing unconscious biases? To provide you with some support, I have some suggested readings that may help you in your journey. If you have a cell phone or an iPad nearby, feel free to take a picture of the screen in front of you. These are all books that are either on my reading list or that I've read. Definitely read the How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. That's a good one. Healing Racial Trauma, another good one. The Why Are All the Black Children Sitting Together in the Cafeteria is an excellent resource. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo was phenomenal. She said some things that only she as a white woman could say to get the message across as well as she does in her book. The Microaggression book by Daryl Wing Sue is a good one. I've read that. Thoroughly enjoyed Tim Weiss's Dear White America. If you're a sarcastic person, you'll love that one. And there are some other suggested text on this screen. So once again, if you have your cell phone out, take a photo of this slide. These are all suggested readings that you can go back to look at to further your knowledge about social justice issues.